The Sri Lankan economy is in doldrums. Well, it's a very well-known fact that there are so many challenges that our economy is going through right now. Globally, we are making the headlines for all the wrong reasons. Amidst all this turmoil, what should you know as a business leader, a business decision maker, an entrepreneur? What are the things that you need to know about our economy? And most importantly, how can you navigate your way amidst all this turmoil? After all, some of the most successful businesses in the world had been built during recessions and tough economic times. As the saying goes, and as what we believe here in Bisnomics, when the tough happens, when the going gets tough, the tough gets going. Welcome to your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. This is Bisnomics. I'm Tharandoamarasekara. And today we will be welcoming back a very special guest we had some time ago to speak on some of the developments that had taken place after that discussion. Our special guest of today's show is none other than Chayu Damsinghe, product head at Frontier Research. Chayu, well, I told you so is something that we like to say, but when it comes to predictions about how bad the economy can get, having the ability to say I told you so, I'm sure it's not a very pleasant situation to be in. But once again, welcome to Bisnomics. Absolute pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me back, Tarindu.
Chayu, let's get to the point. When we spoke a few months back, we said we might go bankrupt. Now we are officially bankrupt. The global business headlines almost every other day is about how Sri Lanka has gone bankrupt. What does this really mean for a country, and how bad is the situation?
So when a country is debt, so we're talking about our debt in this context, we can't pay, a country can't pay their debt, it goes into default. So for a country, technically you can't go bankrupt in the sense a business can, but this is the closest it really ends up getting. You go into default on your debt, that is you stop making these payments. It's bad, there's no question about it, right? The fact that we are come down to a point that we had to default is quite bad, but I think it's more important to look at the fact that it's rather than the default itself being the problem, rather the fact that we are in an economic situation that necessitated a default. Now what we have gone through is what we call a selective default, where we decided to default on our sovereign bond payments, that is our commercial bond payments, and most of our bilateral payments. Multilateral payments as well as rupee payments have been set aside. Those are not going to be restructured, defaulted upon. It's a bad situation, but again, it's the negativity comes from the overall economic situation. The fact that locally we have all these forex shortages, that's not directly as a cause of the result of the default, but rather the fact that we have these forex shortages, petrol queues, diesel queues, gas queues, all of those are a factor that have as a result of overall economic situation. So it is definitely a bad situation we are definitely in. What we need to move from the debt side, this also means we can't access additional financing from commercial markets for quite some time. We need to restructure our debt. That's a long drawn out process. So it's a tough time to go through this really tough period ahead, and the default is just one part of what we're going through.
Correct. And the talk of the town is that we should have gone for debt restructuring and additional financing and all that few years ago. And despite our reserves really dwindling and going down, even at the beginning of this year we saw there were certain massive ISB payments that were being made. So with the money we had for our essentials, I believe we kept on paying some of the debt that we had without necessarily going for a restructuring. So this is like if I have 1,000 rupees in my hand and I have the debtor calling, but I also have sick people in my home, I decide to give the money to the debtors, or the people I borrowed from, or rather the people who are coming and asking for the money from me, and I am not looking after my own home. Is this not a similar situation?
It's very similar, and in fact I would actually go a little further. Instead of talking in the context of an individual that you borrowed from, think of it like a bank, right? You have some sort of debt with your bank, and you also need that money to make sure your kids get food, that make sure that you yourself have food to eat. Now generally, even in a context like Sri Lanka, when you're in that kind of situation, the banks aren't going to come to your house and take away the money that you have to feed your children. What's generally going to happen is you're going to have some sort of discussion with yourself. How can I don't have the ability to pay you. What can we do? What kind of arrangement can we enter in? Is it going to be restructure this debt? Are we going to sell off some sort of asset and we're going to reprofile the debt? Some sort of arrangement you got to really end up in. And Sri Lanka,
something manageable, something sustainable is the word.
Exactly. You need to get into some sort of sustainable situation on your debt, and that's the same thing that the country also needs to really get into. We just waited until our reserves basically ran dry, and we were forced into that process rather than taking proactive steps. I mean, we took some sort of proactive step, but it was very late. It definitely should have happened, if not years ago, at least months ago. Sometime last year, we could have. There's a great opportunity to do that in 2020, where the pandemic was hitting, and there's a lot more global acceptance of that. That would have been a really good point for us to get through with that and get through it with the minimal consequences. But we didn't make use of the opportunity, which means that where we are right now, the situation has deteriorated completely, and that's only when we actually started taking the correct steps.
So it's more like running to the ICU when the, I would say, when the funeral parlor is in sight, some kind of situation.
Very, very, very good.
Chayu, in terms of the implications on our banking system, now let's talk about our banking system. Now, there is a lot of discussion, will the banking system or will the banks face issues because of this, because of not having enough funds, not having enough money, possibly high amount of bad debts coming in. Let's keep in mind that the last few years when the banks calculate their profits, they don't really have a massive allocation for bad debts because of the moratoriums, and the debt relief and the relief time periods are still in place. But what is the implication for the banking system? Is there a chance that our banking systems might also collapse, number one? And number two, when our banks are unable to meet some of the letters of credit and some of the other, letter of credit is more like a promise of payment into the future, when those are not met, is there a chance that our banks will also get blacklisted? And let's keep in mind, a leading public sector bank was blacklisted just a few months before.
Yeah, so the banking sector, I think we can look at it from two sides of it, the dollar side and the rupee side.
Correct.
Now, the dollar side very much is in distress. I think that's like explicitly visible to everyone. The very fact that we can't meet dollar payments, the very fact that the banking system can't muster up enough dollars even to sometimes pay for essential, shows that you have that dollar kind of crisis there. So that's not new, essentially. That's been happening for a few months. So for that to be resolved, you need.
Just to add to that, for example, if you are following a particular foreign study program, earlier you just enter your credit card and you make the payment. Now you have to speak to the bank, literally beg from the bank, I have to pay this for my child's education. Can you please allow this to happen? And then that's what it has come to that.
Exactly, it's really, really bad.
Yeah.
Now, solving that essentially requires more money coming into our banking system from outside. There's no other way out of that, and there's very little we can do outside of encouraging that to happen. So that's a problem, but that's not something that's necessarily going to result in a collapse of the banking system. This is what that looks like, right? The fact that we can't make those payments, that is what the negative circumstance there is. On the rupee side, yes, as a result of all these kinds of pressures on the economy, the governor recently said it's probably going to be the largest contraction in our economy on record. Lots of high interest rates, and how different companies will have difficulty refinance. There will be pressure for sure, but as the central bank themselves said as well, the central bank in these instances can act as what we call a lender of last resort.
Correct.
That means if things go bad on the rupee side, the central bank can easily recapitalize the banking system. So I don't think personally that there's no real need to worry that the banking system will collapse and you completely, from a rupee perspective, not have access to your money, you'll lose all your money. I don't think that's necessarily something to worry about, because the central bank has a provision. The central bank can easily recapitalize the banks, and they've said they're perfectly willing to do that. So I don't think that kind of collapse is something to really be worried about from the perspective of your money. But of course, on the dollar side, you have the issue, but we are going through the issue right now. There's nothing further to happen. Blacklisting is for that to happen, the banks need to default on their own debts, and generally, from what I know, it's not very likely to happen for the Sri Lankan system just yet. Of course, if the situation continues to worsen even more, that means if we've taken some steps to go down the right path, if we reverse those and go back the other way, correct, that is definitely a possibility. That is definitely a big risk to watch out for there.
And I believe that already in some countries of the world, for example, Lebanon, there's an issue where you can't go and get all the money you want. If you have 1 million, the bank might say, no, today we can only issue 10,000 or 50,000 or something like that. So the point to be noted here, I believe, is that things are pretty bad, but it can also get worse.
It very much can. So I'll take the Lebanon example and use the Sri Lankan example as well.
Correct.
Now,
maybe like a short comparison.
Exactly. Now, even right now, actually not just right now, but for a few months now, if you have a significant amount of dollars that you hold in your own bank account, withdrawing those all at once is quite difficult. That has been happening for a few months now. Lebanon system is slightly different in the sense that of course right now we can do any withdrawals of rupees that we want. There is no restriction there outside of short term, an ATM might have run out of money one day, but outside of that there is no problem there. In Lebanon, a significant part, I think a majority of the banking system runs on dollars. So, it is not that the Lebanese lira, Lebanese pound is what runs the most of their system, it is on dollars. So, on that same basis, the same way that in Sri Lanka dollar withdrawals are hard, in Lebanon they are as well, but of course in Lebanon they have explicitly kind of put some sort of deposit freeze on dollar deposits. So, withdrawing that is quite difficult. The Lebanese system is very complex compared to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is nowhere near Lebanon. We are getting a little closer, but it is still quite some distance away. To do just a quick comparison is that our currency now are maybe in the 360 to 370 range. If we are talking about it being similar to Lebanon, we are talking about it being somewhere close to about 2,000 or 3,000, right. So, it is like an order of magnitude away.
Let's talk about these international sovereign bonds, where when the government came and said, look, we are defaulting, and that led to so many concerns about the economy, about the survival of the economy, and I think the riots, even in the streets, the riots got worse when this news came out. Globally, we are completely tarnished as an economy. Chayu, what exactly does this mean? First of all, how did we get to this point of having to default on the ISB? Is it excessive borrowing or borrowing beyond our means and investing that money into projects that hardly generate any revenue? Where did we really go wrong with all this borrowing? Because here's the thing, our total borrowings are said to be more than $50 billion. If a country, successive governments have borrowed that amount of money, now governments borrow to spend for the economy. There has to be some progress, there has to be some benefit to the economy. Instead, we see the queues, we see the lack of resources. Clearly, something went wrong in this whole process. As an economist, what's your take on it?
So, to put it very shortly, we consumed it. Now, for decades, we've had both this budget deficit problem where the government's revenue and expenditure is in a negative balance, but we also have this current account deficit. That means the country's overall dollar income and expenditure. We
import more than we export, probably.
Exactly, very much. We import more than we export, and also in terms of the other aspects of the dollar income and expenditure, it's in a negative balance. Now, what that means is that when both of those sides are in a negative balance, there is no other option than to borrow. Some of it is borrowed locally in the rupee system, and of course, for the dollar requirements, you have to borrow in dollar terms as well. Now, then the question is, why is our revenue side on the rupee side rather, why is that in a negative balance, and why is the dollar side in a negative balance? The rupee side is in negative balance, although the general sense is that it's due to expenditure reasons. That's actually not very true. Compared to other countries, especially in the Asia Pacific region, we are somewhere in the bottom 25% of countries in terms of state expenditure, but we are somewhere near the lowest in the world in terms of government revenue. Our tax levels and our tax rates and our tax compliance, all of that is really, really low.
Even so tax collection to a certain extent.
Exactly, it's really, really bad, and that starts from the tax rates. There are some of the really low for countries that happen. I think if you take a list of countries with low tax rates outside of the countries that have zero, we always feature in those lists. And there's a question, why do we need such low taxes in a context where we have a lot of consumption in the economy? Because consumption in the economy leads into the second problem. The more you consume, because a lot of it going to be imports, directly like the fuel for our cars, or indirect like the fertilizer to grow our rice locally, means that we import more, we import and import, we consume and consume. That means dollars leave the country, depreciation, inflation, that side of thing happens. As long as this side is in a negative balance, you can't build up your reserves except through borrowing. Now, after 2019 and 2020, we got locked out of our borrowing systems, which means all the reserves we had to go into filling that negative balance.
And adding to the turbulence was the fact that tourism almost went to a zero and no tourism dollars coming in either.
Exactly, that means the deficit, which was let's say over here, now just significantly widened, and we printed a lot of money, which means that the import side widened. And now you just, whatever reserves that you had, you're somewhere at the 7 to 8 billion mark before the new government came in, and all of that got used up there until essentially came to what was essentially a zero number.
And I believe it's how much of dollars do they say we have, Chayu?
So, I mean, the end May number should be out sometime this week or next. The official total number is probably somewhere in the 1.7, 1.8 billion number. About 1.5 billion of that is a Chinese swap that's not usable.
Correct.
So, official usable reserves would be somewhere in the $200, $300 million range.
Correct.
However, what we actually have accessible is probably, I mean, it's probably it's probably correct to think of it as zero. And then what we are doing is essentially matching any inflows that we get to our outflows. There is no additional savings.
So some of the cricketers who play IPL in India have more dollar reserves than Sri Lanka does right now.
I think that's not wrong to say, yes. I think that's a funny way to say it, but that's very, very true.
Stay tuned. We will be back after this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Our focus today is on the current economic turmoil of Sri Lanka. What's exactly going on? What's the way forward? And most importantly, when can we see some end to the pain that our citizens are enduring for no fault of theirs? And our special guest for today is none other than Chayu Damsinghe. Chayu, now let's talk about the IMF discussion, because that's the big topic. We hear about various discussions taking place. We hear that IMF said this and then IMF said that, and there's so much of hullabaloo going on with regard to this. So just to demystify and debunk any myths and any concerns on this matter, a few questions to you. Firstly, how does the IMF process work, number one? And number two, what exactly has been the output of the discussions so far? Let's start with that.
Right. So the IMF's role, I think even last time I gave it a sense of it, it does serve as a kind of a lender of last resort for countries. So when countries get into trouble and get into these economic crises,
like how we have,
then the IMF can step in to support that country. How the process works is, first the country has to approach the IMF, ask for help. You have sorts of discussions. Sometimes you have what we call technical discussions rather than on the program itself. So on technical matters, on fiscal matters, on monetary matters, different things that you might want to talk about. Afterwards, you can have a proper discussion on and explicitly on a program, that is a program of financial support that the IMF will provide to the country, that is money and lending the IMF will provide to the country, and what kind of steps the country themselves will take to ensure that that money is not just wasted and you're actually on a path to kind of some sort of sustainability, some sort of recovery, right? And after that happens, you have to get what you call a staff level agreement, which is the IMF staff themselves agreeing to something with the government. It goes to the IMF's board, and then finally they would have to agree with that themselves, and only then does the disbursement of the money happen. However, for Sri Lanka, because our debt is considered unsustainable both by the IMF and generally considered so, that puts us in a place that the IMF can't legally provide any financial support to us. Therefore, for that to happen, we need to conclude or at least get some sort of progress on our debt restructuring first to make sure that we are on what the IMF calls a quote-unquote a path to debt sustainability. Now, it's a little vague, that term, and it's intentionally left vague from what I understand so as to allow for flexibility in different country situations. So, from what I know, it requires some sort of progress on at least the bilateral front on how China will deal with these debt restructuring negotiations.
Because we need permission from our current debt holders, right, for a debt restructuring.
Yes, so we've suspended our debt, right? So I mean, we could have gotten consent before that, but that's actually not, from what I know and from my view, it's not too much of an important factor. Once you had basically zero reserves, everyone agrees that you're going to not pay your debt. Like there's no question about whether you get permission for that, or we tell you, look, we are not going to pay, but we are going to talk to you. That's what's important, and what defines this idea of a hard default is whether you intend to pay, whether you intend to engage with your creditors, or you're just going to be like, I'm not paying, go away, I don't care what happens to you. That is what a hard default really is about. But if you're engaging with your creditors in good faith, that's fine. Now, you have to agree with your creditors. You'll have to negotiate with them what kind of reduction you're going to get, if any, if you're going to do some sort of extension of the period, some relief period, all those kinds of things you'll have to negotiate and talk out with them. That takes time. It could take 6, 12, even longer in terms of months. So it could even drag into next year. But as long as you can show some sort of progress, some sort of proper progress in the meantime, you might be able to convince the IMF that these guys are on a path to debt sustainability. They're not, eschewing the process. So perhaps we can now properly fully engage with this country as well. So that's the entire process there.
So what's the, as at now, how much of money are we expecting from the IMF? And amidst all these developments, there is also this very interesting talk about one professor, Professor Hankey, who has developed this Hankey's index, and he keeps showing where Sri Lanka is. He keeps asking Sri Lanka to go for currency boards and so on. What exactly is that about, Chayu?
So I'll take those two questions. So first, in terms of where the IMF negotiations are. So we barely started our debt restructuring negotiations. So we need to get that to some sort of conclusion, some sort of progress before long. That has to happen. Right now, we've had one round of technical negotiations with the IMF. There's more to go essentially. So the IMF process has started definitely, but there's in my view, a considerable amount
And I
left to
believe
go
there are, I believe, 1 or 2 leading debt restructuring advisory companies have also been selected by Sri Lanka to work with Sri Lanka. Am I right?
Yes, we we opened it for proposals. They applied, and we finally appointed them just a few weeks ago. So that process has just started. So there's quite a lot to go, in my view, in that whole process. And because Sri Lanka hasn't really engaged with this kind of process before,
Correct.
I think it's also important to understand that even from a government official side of view, they might not have the they don't. I mean, very frankly, they don't have any experience with this kind of situation.
Correct.
So their expectations can also very rapidly change and go one way or the other. So that's something also.
We are swimming in murkier waters, which we have never, a level of murkiness which we haven't seen before.
Exactly, very much. So I mean, that uncertainty, because the uncertainty of the situation and the intensity of the pain that the country is going through economically, also then ties into what what Stephen Hanke, Professor Hanke from I think he's at Johns Hopkins University, but he works at the Cato Institute as well. So very free market kind of policy institute. That the idea behind Professor Hanke's index is essentially looking, I mean, we can simplify it as the unofficial depreciation of the country plus US inflation. That roughly corresponds to what his inflation index is. So that measures essentially something closer to the loss of purchasing power the country has in dollar terms, rather than inflation on the ground necessarily. So it can be an important indicator, but I don't know whether it's accurate to think of it in the context of inflation. It's something altogether different. It matters, however, if you are, for example, a dollar investor investing in Sri Lanka. Now, if you had invested before this whole crisis and now you would have lost into that exact same amount of money that Hanke's index says 110%, then you would have lost 110% kind of inflation on your investment. So I don't know whether that necessarily matters for a Sri Lankan individual living here, but that's essentially how that works. His idea of a currency board, I mean, we can argue about the technicalities of a currency board, but most.
What exactly is a currency board, Chayu?
So a currency board is essentially where a country's money supply, so money printing, anything that we do, is directly linked to a certain amount of dollars. So it's essentially backed up by a certain amount of dollars. That does require then the exchange rate to be pegged and say, look, let's say for $350. 350 rupees, $1, and that is the amount of rupees that we can have in the system, only equal to the amount of dollars that we have. That I mean, there are some technical reasons based on what kind of measure that you use, but essentially it comes down to something in the vicinity of, depending on how you look at it, $5 to $7 billion that we need to even set up a currency board.
Okay.
So I also,
we are a long way off from that.
We are a long way off from that, and it's also not the kind of policy that the IMF themselves also think is very correct. In 1997-8, Indonesia tried to go for a currency board as well. That derailed their conversation. The IMF actually worsened their currency crisis for a little while. So there are questions about whether it's right or wrong. That's often ends up being a very academic debate, to be honest.
Understood.
So I think in like how the most countries have gotten out of it hasn't been through that kind of policy.
Okay. Modern monetary theory. Now, the previous 2 governors of the central bank seemed to be big fans of it. They were speaking about it. They were saying, let's print money and put it to the economy and the productivity will pick up. But clearly we saw the adverse results of it. Chayu, let's try to fathom, what was the thinking in going for this unprecedented level of money printing in the country, and how did that contribute to the mess we are in right now?
So MMT, modern monetary theory, has, I mean, the ideas behind it have been there for like a century or so, despite being called modern.
Correct. But I believe the Keynesian approach.
It's actually a little bit different from the Keynesian approach, but it's essentially where you print money instead of through the government side. The central bank prints money into the system.
Correct.
You look at a goal of, I think, full employment rather than anything else, and inflation is countered through some technical factors as well as through taxation when required. So it is a complicated, very complex thing, very much an academic proposal in my view, just like how you might have seen, there are Marxist ideas that are very academic regardless of whether how they work in real world or not. The academic reality of it is very different from what happens on the ground. So MMT has the same thing. I think regardless of what the academic part of it says, what ends up happening in the world is very different. It essentially becomes, let's print money because the inflation side of it will get handled somehow, right? And the how doesn't often get focused on. So what our previous governors, especially I remember Governor Lakshman talking about, what Sri Lanka is doing is he explicitly said what we're doing is essentially something like MMT. The thing with that is that you could I guess make an argument for that for a country that issues debt in its own currency.
Correct.
We don't. But even for definitely for a country like Sri Lanka, the more you print into the economy, especially when you are a consumption based economy like we are, we consume a lot of things, we do not have a lot of savings in our economy. The more money you put in the economy, that means the more consumption happens. Like if I am selling pens at 50 rupees per pen and you have 100 rupees, each pen is 50. But if you have 200, now each pen is 100 rupees, and that is essentially what happens. But because again, like I said earlier, a lot of our consumption is import driven, directly or indirectly. The more money we pump into the economy, the more consumption happens, more imports happen, more money goes out of the system, and that means more and more depreciation and more inflation. Inflation for Colombo as of end May was something closer to 40%.
Correct.
It could
food inflation I believe is more than 50%.
Exactly, and these overall numbers can very well rise more in the months to come. So before they really start to moderate after these things kind of settle down. So it's very much a key part of how we ended up in this mess, worsening our current account deficit, and instead of fixing our budget deficit through taxation, through encouraging savings in the economy both from the government and private side, you print money into the system instead. So you spend more than you can afford, you buy more than you can afford, and both of that means money leaving the system, you are requiring more debt that you no longer can afford to get, and you are in this whole situation at the end.
So that is a nice summary and a gist of it, Chayu. If the IMF is to come in, and it definitely seems like that is the only option for us right now, and provide this bit of financing, couple of $1 billion at least that we need, what kind of demands do you think will be there from their end? Definitely no fixing of the forex rates, and also I believe that they will have certain demands on certain restructuring of the government sector, and this has also led to the concerns. People are worried, okay, will the public sector jobs be lost and so on. What kind of demands do you think they will be bringing along with them?
I think it's an excellent way to kind of approach that question as well, and approach another side of that question, because I think in my view that the way that Sri Lanka especially, not just Sri Lanka but plenty of countries look at the IMF is not necessarily very accurate of the reality.
Correct.
Instead of thinking of it as conditions that the IMF puts on, I think it's more accurate to think of it as there are certain policies that a country has taken that has led it into some sort of trouble.
Yes.
In order to get out of the trouble, you need to reverse some of those policies. Reversing those policies, because you've kind of been working under something else, is painful. There's no question about it. The IMF steps in to make sure that while those policies will result in some sort of positive result, but it will take time. Until that point, to make sure the country survives, that's what the IMF's role, in my view, is. But the IMF isn't going to lend or give support to a country that's still continuing bad policies. You need to fix your policies.
More like a strict parent.
Very much like a strict parent, I think.
Show me good behavior and thou shall be rewarded.
Exactly. Now, you can argue whether the IMF and especially more developed countries can do more to help countries like Sri Lanka, right? Like for example, directly fund money into alleviating poverty and additional poverty caused by the current situation. Those are definitely valid concerns. But I think what the IMF's conditions are, to use the common term though, is that you need to look at primarily removing and reducing this kind of money printing idea of it, right? That means you need to move away from that, but that means that you still have the budget deficit to finance. To bridge that, you need to raise taxes. I don't think that the IMF is very much about large public sector expenditure cuts. Like I said earlier, Sri Lanka's expenditure isn't very large compared to other countries as well. So that's not necessarily where our problem is. It is possible that in the short term, because taxes take time to result in some sort of benefit, we might have some sort of short term measures on the expenditure side as well to make sure that we basically survive this year or so. That is very much a possibility, but large scale public sector job cuts I don't think is necessarily in the cards.
And I think they have issued a statement on that as well. IMF themselves had issued a certain statement on that.
I think the IMF generally talks about the sometimes need to increase investment in the human development side, to increase investment into social safety nets, for example. They're working, for example, with the World Bank for things like that. So there are those kinds of things as well. On the condition side, the restructuring of the public sector, there might be things that you talk about, expenditure rationalization to make sure that individual public sector entities don't make massive losses that have to be bankrolled by the public sector bank. So don't have CPC making 100 billion rupees in a loss that People's Bank has to somehow find money to pay finance. And if you're making a loss continuously, it's not like you can pay back that loan ever again either. So there are those kinds of adjustments that will be needed to make. But outside of that, it's very much about looking at the policies that got us here, reversing those. That's essentially where we need to go.
Understood, Chayu. We will be back after this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics. Our focus today is on the current economic turmoil and what you need to know on what exactly is going on. And we are in conversation with Chayu Damsinghe. Chayu, let's talk about the recent tax increases. The VAT has been increased, and the taxation on so many other services such as telecom has also been increased. And along with this, naturally, the cost of production, the cost of doing business is going up. What is your advice to any business owner in terms of how to navigate during these tough time periods? I mean, apart from, buckle up and get it done, or just see what you can do, because business owners also, they are squeezed. They have loans to pay, and they have to pay salaries to their people, and the moratoriums are ending. The economic situation is not good. Raw material prices have gone up. This is like you're stuck into one camp called poor economy, and you're getting bombarded with rockets from all possible sides and angles and dimensions. What is your advice to the business owners?
So, I think it comes from the point that over the last not just few years, but for a while, our business environment has very much been driven by what is, in my view, investment into more unproductive elements, right? Let those be infrastructure that doesn't directly relate to any sort of increase in value, a large investment into
so tall towers with absolutely zero revenue.
Exactly, right? Like that level, that side of the construction sector, does that really result in a lot of benefit in the economy? And therefore, a lot of businesses that are there today, because these are businesses that have come up over the last 10-15 years, do have direct or very indirect ties to this economic system we are in. Therefore, one key aspect of what's going to happen over the next few months, years, is, in my view, a restructuring of our overall economy, how our economy works, especially moving away from one that is more consumption driven by the domestic customer, is going to change. I don't think there's any way around that. However, two things that can be done is look at whatever your business is, whether there are, I mean, this is my personal, not reflective of an employee, but look at ways that you can look at external consumers. I don't know what that would be, how that would be, whether that's realistic for your industry or not, but that's one way.
External, is it out of the country or?
Out of the country, not dependent on the local consumer, because that is going to be a very difficult thing to do. But also on that side, there are going to be things, the more, I would almost say, more orthodox ideas about investment that governments, even though unpopular decisions, the government might be forced into those right now. So, this might be one of the few instances you can really push into getting, capitalizing on those kinds of situations. On the other hand, the other thing I would say for any business is that recognize that, especially business that are, larger business case, this matters more, is that recognize that plenty of people in the country, individuals, are going to suffer massively. So, do what you can to make sure that doesn't happen. I don't think in this current context, looking after your profits, shareholder value should necessarily, this is a personal view of mine, but should not be what your primary concern should be right now, but rather looking at making sure that the overall situation in the country does not get worse.
The ecosystem is intact.
Yes, exactly. Don't try to break the bank so that you can keep your profits right now. That's not what you should be doing, because if you try to do that, your business, sometimes your individual existence in this country might not be something you can guarantee. So, make sure that you care about the people right now, because that is something you really, really need to do to make sure the ecosystem, like as you said, really survives over the kind of period to come.
Now, let's talk about the sale of state-owned enterprises, because I believe we have more than 500 SOEs, and many of them, majority of them, are actually loss-making. They are not doing well, and hence also comes the question and concern: should the state be facilitating business, or should the state be doing business? With all these concerns and matters coming up, Chayu, what are your thoughts? Do you think that some of the state-owned enterprises need to be privatized? Because, for example, we take the airline of the country. We saw under certain foreign airlines, when it was managed, it was doing very well, very profitable. But then no sooner it's back with the government, we hear about massive losses. Clearly, it's not a problem with the company, it's a problem with the management. So, what do you think? Do you think that some of the sale and privatization of some of these state-owned enterprises is the way forward?
So, I think that has to be done very much when you're looking at how to restructure assets, companies owned by the state, very much has to be on a case by case basis. I am generally very reluctant to think that a mass privatization drive is correct for Sri Lanka. I think that's too destabilizing to the Sri Lankan situation,
Correct.
socially, politically. I mean, you have a lot, some capital that you can use right now, but whether using it for privatization, especially in the context that our expenditure is not amazingly high, I'm not sure whether that necessarily the right way to go.
But then again, the talk of the town, especially among global media, is that there's a fire sale coming up in Sri Lanka, where so many valuable assets will be sold for quite a low price.
So, I think the biggest loss makers in our state system, as I understand it, are ones directly tied to energy. So, CPC, CEB, transport, railway, those are the ones that make bigger losses. So, what can you do to make sure that those losses do not happen? Let it be price adjustments, but at the same time making sure that the most vulnerable are not hit by that. I think some sort of wealth transfer system is what you really need a country like Sri Lanka. You need to move on it fast. Use the system you have right now, of course, because you can't waste time, creating a perfect system. Do use what you have, but also work on improving that system. That needs to happen. Now, whether actual sale of assets happens or not, I don't really know. There might be some that ends up happening as a result of requiring some sort of revenue in the short term, but like whether that's something that's going to be a savior for Sri Lanka, I don't necessarily buy that argument fully.
Understood. Let's talk about import controls. Now, once again, lots of misinformation is going around on this. Now, we saw recently that some of the import duty, the import taxes have been increased, and we saw certain people reporting and saying now the prices are going to go up twice. So, Chayu, in your experience, I mean, from what you understand, what exactly is the current situation with regard to the increase of the import duties and import tariffs? And we also hear that on certain items the import tariffs have been brought down, or rather it has been allowed to be imported. And what kind of a situation are we seeing there, and what kind of a price change are we expecting with regard to that?
Right. So, the relaxation of this licensing system, in my personal view, I think that's a good decision, because I think having these licensing situation certification systems, what you call the license Raj, can very easily breed into some sort of corruption. You can just, someone can pay, and only that happens, and you have.
And we all know in Sri Lanka how the license get provided most of the time.
Exactly, a lot of monopolies get created as well. So, I don't think that's a very right way to handle things. On the other side, what we are doing right now with the import duties, from my view, is twofold. There is an attempt to control excessive consumption of those items. What defines excessive is going to be up to anyone to decide. But also bring in some sort of revenue from that as well, due to the immediate requirement for the government to shore up some revenue. I think there are other things you could probably do as well. For example, I think the fact that taxes, especially the excise levy on cigarettes and cigarettes, alcohol hasn't gone up. I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity there. It doesn't really make sense for cigarette prices, alcohol prices to be broadly the same. There's a little increase now with the VAT increase, but broadly the same as they were a year ago, when things like rice have gone up 50, 60, 70%, right? I don't think that makes sense, and that's always been a massive income earner for the government, because the demand for that, despite different theories floating around, is very inelastic. Whatever the price, people are going to buy it from the formal system as well. That's always been what has happened in Sri Lanka, whatever the price increase. So, that's a huge source of revenue the government could have taken, and also those things, because the economy is so interconnected, that very well leads to some sort of import contraction as well. So, I think that things happen. In terms of price increases from the current things, it very much depends on what consumers, what companies rather decide to do, like whether they actually decide to absorb some of that cost right now in the context of the overall economy being bad, or whether they are going to push that cost to the consumer. Different consumers in different industries will lead that differently. There will also be a significant amount of defaults on the VAT as well, where the company doesn't pay the VAT to the government. So, how that factors into this whole situation will also be something to consider. There will definitely be more price increases of goods, and inflation will definitely rise, but to what extent it rises is very difficult to forecast right now. That's one of the hardest things to figure out, how high inflation will go before it inevitably starts falling back down.
On a final note, in the last 2 minutes, I want to ask you, where to from now? Is it going to get worse before it gets better? Some say that we are going to have the worst months coming up in July and August. What is your take on it, Chayu?
It depends on what we define by worst, but I would say that since about May onwards, in different ways we've been at the worst, and that worst will continue in different flavors for some period of time. For example, sometime last month is when we had these massive fuel queues, right? That could reduce over the months to come as price hikes get absorbed into the system, liquidity comes in. But could there be more unemployment in the months to come? Is that worse than the fuel queues, right? It's very difficult to say it in that context.
Which worse is worse?
Exactly. So, you're going to have different really bad situations in May, in June, in July, in August. Hopefully, by September, October, November, the last few months of the year, things will start to recover. Now, because the government is taking correct steps on the economic side, at least broadly in the correct direction, let us say, expecting things to stabilize somewhere around here in different ways and then start to improve in the months to come. Hopefully, I mean, it's going to take quite a lot of time for us to get back to where we were in, like, say, 2016-17, which was, I think, the high point, or somewhere in 17-18 actually. But the recovery will probably start sometime end of this year, moving into next. The worst of the pain will start to move into our past, but it will still be tough. We'll have to work within a much different economy, a much different Sri Lanka, not based on the kinds of more unsustainable measures of the past. But as long as we continue to do that, the pathway forward is more positive. I think almost every country in the world has gone through a debt crisis, a severe financial crisis like this in their past at some point. Correct. The developed countries maybe in the 40s, 50s, developing countries in the 80s, 90s right now as well. Sri Lanka hasn't, so the fact that Sri Lanka is finally doing it, as painful as it is, as terrible as it is now, does also mean that there is a great opportunity for us to restructure our economy to a more sustainable, more long-term footing. And hopefully we do that, and 10, 20, 30 years later, we can look back and say, look, Sri Lanka is now a far, far, far better place than it had been in the past. And despite all the pain, for that we are thankful.
Chayu, Damsinghe, absolute pleasure to have hosted you today. Thank you for all the wealth of knowledge you shared, and we wish you good luck with all your endeavors. And once again, thanks for your insights you provided on Bisnomics.
Thanks, Daniel.
It's a tough road ahead, but as the age-old wisdom goes, tough roads often lead to beautiful destinations. And let's hope that the tough measures that are being taken will lead us back to an acceptable state, a sustainable state, a state from which the Sri Lankan economy can grow, and along with that, uplifting the lives of the citizens of this nation. I'm Tharinda Amarasekara, and no matter what business you may be in, have a profitable week ahead. I'll see you with the next episode. This is Bisnomics.